Hello there, and welcome back to our Lando Timelapse series. In today's episode we will come back to the Emporium building to finish it. You could kinda say we coronate it, and it gets the proper roof it deserves. As I mentioned in the last episode, the first thing that we have to care about is the angle of this roof. I first had the angle at 15 degrees, but I will rework it right now to 11.25. The main reason for that was, as you just see here, that this middle part, you have there like those very short sides of it. And if the degree is too steep, you just don't have enough width at the very top of this roof to make this octagonal shape happening. And therefore 11.25 worked much better. You could of course ask now the question if the octagonal roof in the middle of it has a different degree than the tilted roof right and left of it. As you know, I'm just working on the opposing corner building where you have 20 degrees of anglement. So when you are comparing them, they are completely different in their anglement. And at least on the Emporium building, it's something between 10 to 15 degrees. For now, when I'm creating something like that, I have that reference image on a second monitor right beside me. And I have here a degree ruler, so a ruler that's only job is to measure out the degree of something. And I just hold it onto the monitor. And it's actually working quite fine. But the issue becomes oftentimes the perspective of those images. Every image they are shot with different cameras, different lens widths, and just with lens distortion also. When you take a look on Google Street View images, they are 360 degrees. And that means you have this fisheye effect at some point. So my preferred images are images that are shot from very far away and where you zoom in. And that way you don't have this effect happening and the perspective is a lot calmer and it's not so much distorted. Sometimes it's a huge issue where you just have to work now with a certain image. Let's say it's the only image that exists from a very hideous spot here, then you just have to work with this image. And if it's heavily distorted, it kinda misleads you in believing that something only has like a degree of 20, but actually it's 30 degrees. And so you really have to be cautious sometimes on what you look at here. And this kinda leads us here maybe to a topic where we could start on, and that's about forced perspective. I feel like we did not talk about that so far, but it's a huge thing, not only on this main street, but pretty much all throughout this theme park. So in some way it's kinda an optical illusion in some way, or like a technique that you just apply on something. For example, on architecture or on people or objects. I mean, the prime example of that I feel like is Lord of the Rings. You see it very well when Gandalf enters this hobbit hole. Because those hobbits are of course not that small in reality, you had to kinda work with forced perspective to make them that small appearing in relationship to the actor of Gandalf. So imagine you have a scene where you have Gandalf and the hobbit sitting on a table and they're eating something. So from the camera this looks like it, but when you take a look behind the curtain of this set, how it's actually arranged is that you have Gandalf in front with the chair, then you have the table that is 2 meters away from him in the distance, and beyond that you have like the hobbit also 2 or 3 meters behind that. But the trick here is that you make the table and the chair that this hobbit is sitting on much bigger than they should be in reality. Because remember, the more far away something is from the camera, the size of it is decreasing, and therefore you compensate that by adjusting the size of it. When you resize everything there is except the hobbit will be a lot less smaller appearing than everything else. It's of course a very complicated topic and I believe I can't properly explain it here in detail. When you are really interested into that topic, I recommend watching this little snippet on YouTube when you search for Lord of the Rings forced perspective. I think it's vital to understand this method because it's crucial for what we are doing right now in the park. It's a lot different than compared to this Lord of the Rings example. We are not just working with one set perspective from the camera in the movie, and therefore we have to think all the time about every perspective you can take on in this park. Every time you look on those buildings, you have a different perspective. This simple fact kinda limits us in how to use this forced perspective. The only common ground that we have from all those perspectives is the height, I think. When you read a little bit about this topic of forced perspective within any Disney park, it's no secret that they make great use out of this technique. When you take every building on Main Street, for example, when you really look onto them and measure the size of each floor there is, you will usually see that with every floor that comes next after that, they will shrink in size. That's of course something that would not work in reality. You need a certain height in the building so that the rooms work effective and you don't break your head against the ceiling of it. And therefore, I come back to something I talked in the last episode, and that it's of course a fake facade. But because you have this shrinkage happening in the facade of it, when you look from the height of a guest here and you look up, you have this feeling that the building is actually much bigger than it is in reality. Those different floors, they look to you like they are in the right size, but actually that's not the case at all. But since we are used to that in the real world, we judge the sizing of this building much bigger than it actually is in reality here. So in some way you could say that your own senses playing a game with you here. Of course the Imagineers of this place made this illusion here, but at least to a degree I believe that your own senses are helping and making this work in the end. Later on, when we working maybe on the castle, you can see this motive coming back. The castle by itself is actually pretty big in reality, but it appears even more bigger because you have this happening. And I don't know how many floors you have there. I'm pretty certain that you have a lot. But this brings me of course to the point here that the facade on the outside doesn't really match to what is happening on the inside. At least on those upper floors. On the ground floor, it has to work in most cases. But you aren't really limited to any structural dependencies of the building itself. What I mean by that is that most of those buildings that you are seeing here on the main street, most certainly those materials that you see there on the outside and all those building elements, that's not actually what supports them. So any supports that really hold now the structure is probably well hidden behind this facade in some way. Maybe with the exception of brickwork. I could imagine that that's actually structural supporting. But other than that, I feel like there's a steel housing or support structure behind the facade of it. When you take a look, for example, on Space Mountain, you have a concrete steel construction behind the facade of it, and then you put all your Space Mountain around that. And in a way, there we are again at the same topic from the last episode. What is real and what is fake? It comes all down to your own personal definition of that. If your definition of fake is that everything that you see from the outside doesn't match with the structural components on the inside, then you could call everything in the Magic Kingdom fake. At least in my definition of that, it includes also what effect it has on yourself as a human being. If it makes the illusion of being that what it pretends to be, without creating any doubt in your mind that it's not like that, then I see there no difference to any real building out there. At least all the time when I look on reference images of this main street, I'm absolutely floored by all those little details that they put on those buildings. You can of course see and feel there that it's something very precious and valued. I mean, after all, there's probably a lot of money gone into this park here to create that. And from time to time, you have to refurbish that and keep it pristine in some way, if that even is possible. But the point I'm trying to make here, the building quality or the detail quality on those buildings is very high. And it supports, of course, what I said earlier with this definition thing. When you make this illusion in its execution so perfect to what it would look like in reality, then people will buy it and almost nobody will get the impression, oh, this all looks very fake and cheaply done. No, it fulfills here its purpose in providing a very Victorian-styled architecture that lures you into this thematic area. That's what we want. We want to lure you in, that you stay within this area, that you get this experience, that you are in a complete different world, that you time travel. And if the brickwork on the outside is not the actual brickwork that holds this building in place, who cares at the end? So maybe at this stage, let's come back to the build. As you are seeing, we're working now on the main part of this roof. And as always, the difficult part was to judge the right proportion. When you see the tilted roof on the left side, you always have a reference point in height. And with that, I could lay out the trim area on this tower much more easily. Also, you see those round window shutters that give this distinct look to this building. And for those little ornaments on the very bottom of this trim area, I just found those wooden small brackets to work wonderful, I think. When I created this building, I played around with the depth of it. So I pushed and pulled those art pieces that you see as a surface there, just a little bit fore and back to get a little bit more contrast out of the facade of it. In general, I would say that contrast is one of the most important things when you are creating such buildings, that you always have there a nice contrast between more darker and more brighter spots. I believe we had that already in a previous episode, but when you imagine having this building in just one color, then it's so much more hard for our brain to understand those informations, how it's built in 3D space. But you can even have the opposite of that, too much contrast. And that's even more annoying, I think, if you have now super bright and dark surfaces that are too different from each other. Or when the color is too saturated. That's really something that can get very bad very quickly. If you have a color that has like almost 100% red in it, then it's far too saturated. Therefore, always when I pick and choose colors, and you see it also on those reference images, all colors on that, they are relatively dimmed down, you could say, and they are not so in your face when you see them. When you take a look on those reference images, we see that all colors you have there, they are more of a sandy and warm tone. And even if there is a more extreme color within that, it's in the same realm of this warm tone. In the game, I tried so far to stick only to a small range of colors. There's also a practical side effect of that, where you can just go back to all buildings prior and pick and choose the color there. But the main reason for that is just that I don't want to overwhelm you with different color tones, and that there is a specific color code for each area in the park. So for example, this white that you see on this emporium building, this vintage white, I used this specific color on all buildings throughout every building. And in that way, you kinda get a connection point here, where the architecture is changing, the building elements are changing, the function of the building is changing, but the one thing that is not changing is this one color. And that makes everything that we built so far looks as one unity. It's one arrangement. And so for example, later on I could imagine on Tomorrowland, you have there on those space rocks a very distinct purple-blue color. And maybe we use then this color there, that it repeats itself throughout this whole area. So for example, if you are working on your own park, this could be a great starting point for another idea or something special in an area, that you choose their specific color that repeats itself throughout this area. So even if you don't have a deeper logic behind why you use a specific color for that, it kinda sticks with people, I believe. I mean, after all, we are all human beings. We pick up so many things very subconsciously. And especially if something is very red or blue, we pick that up. It's kinda a warning sign. I mean, that's also why warning signs are mostly red, right? Or you see it oftentimes in games where you highlight certain things in a specific color. So for example, in Half-Life 2, all explosive barrels were very red. Or like in any climbing game, when you have there like a trim where you have to climb, it's mostly in a yellowish color. And therefore, you kinda influence the player in some way, or helping him with that visual storytelling, what he has to do in some way. And so here in Planet Coaster, why shouldn't we not use this method? We don't have to necessarily build any new geometric form here. We just repaint that whole thing, and then it has a different layer of importance to any guest throughout this park. I believe you can make certain things so much more interesting, or let's say apparent to people, if you make a strong color change there. All those things I just said, they are of course applying to any park that you are creating from your own imagination. Right here, it's about a recreation, so we are kinda limited within that. Or you could say all those colors are already set for us, but the same effect should also apply here. But maybe at this stage, let's come back to the build. So as you see, we started with the construction of those windows on the tilted roof. And for this time, I choose no wooden planks for this curvature. Since we now have the 5% thing with the art pieces, we can just use them instead. And we don't have this a little bit annoying texture on those wooden planks anymore. And so the big question here was how to create this little ornament on the sides. And the only fitting pieces I found were those mythology ornament pieces. Normally they are so oversized, even on the smallest scale setting, that you barely can use them. But the trick that made them working here was to rotate them a slight bit, so that you don't see this trim area on the top part of it. And as you see, I kept them modular, so that you can use the same window just for the middle section here, where pretty much this window becomes a doorway, or I would assume like a window that is a little bit more emphasized. I said here doorway, maybe not only by accident. I could imagine you somewhere need an entrance point to this roof. Most certainly you could also enter this roof just by going over the trim area of the blue building on the left side through the backlot. But that just seems a little bit scary or unsafe, and where I instead believe that the hidden entrance point is just here at this very window. I mean, this is a pretty underestimated topic, I believe, of keeping those roofs clean, and that you don't have there any residue of weather or bird poop that could fall onto people's head. I mean, you have here like this trim area around the Emporium building. If there's something that falls beyond that, it could hit a guest, and we surely don't want that to happen, right? And also for other reasons, for security or electricians that have to keep the lighting system running, or where they might have to replace a certain light bulb around the trim area, it just makes sense to have here some access point. So right here I cover up the back part of this roof, so that we have a nice, tidy and clean looking rear side of it. It's always a little bit tricky, because everything that you see there on the front side, you have to make sure that it doesn't stick into the rear side of it. This kinda reminds me a little bit to what I had oftentimes happening also in Planet Coaster 1, where you had so many pieces in the game that you just couldn't use because either they were too big or they were too themed and they had something annoying about them. And the extra downer back then was the inability of scaling anything. You just had to live with certain elements sticking out in the backside, and so something like this here would be almost impossible in the prequel. And so all the time I had this happening back then, the idea grew in my mind that it would be so cool to cut them off in some way, or to make certain parts of those objects invisible. Back in those days I was sometimes very jealous about city skylines. You had their mods in this game that would allow you to modify the scenery pieces, or those decorative pieces within that. So for example, if you have like a little model there or like some object within that, you could just modify the geometry of that. And the same thing I would like here, of course, that you just, as we are creating this spire on the very top part of this roof, those spears that I used here, I would love if you could remove the shaft on it, so that you only have the tip of it. Because in a second you will see that it kind of forces me now to position this fence in a specific way. You will see that the shaft on it sticks out at the very bottom of it. And the only two options that are left here are either to remove this spear and complete, or to rescale the whole thing so that you just don't see this shaft sticking out at the bottom of it. Obviously I stick to option 2 here, since the visual of this spire comes from this spear mainly. But however, I think this spire works also in that way. I scaled it down now a little bit. It's maybe not that accurate to the reference image, but still it's pretty damn close, I believe, at least in Planet Coaster terms. And since we have the scale feature here, thank God, it's maybe not that relevant anymore. In Planet Coaster 1 I would take it every time, but maybe here it's a good thing that we don't have it, since I would become probably mentally insane after that. It's also the same thing with like the scale thing, when everything in this game, every object would be downscalable to 5%. Completely nuts here. And so therefore we have here a nice sweet balance between what is reasonable and what's realistic. But having said that, knowing at the same time that we are already above 200,000 pieces in this park and we aren't even halfway through the main street, you can do the math on your own here. But maybe that's the perfect introduction now to talk about the performance. We probably didn't talk about that in the last 10 episodes so far. The last time I talked about that, we had this special episode where I showed also footage at the end of Planet Coaster 1 and the Anaheim Park. If I'm right here, it's the 18th episode called Gamechanger, and at least for me, in terms of the performance of the game, it's an absolute game changer. So if you haven't watched that, please do. I will quickly recap it here. So the big discovery here was that you have a graphics setting in this game called DLSS, and when you enable that, the game gets rendered at a smaller resolution and it gets then upscaled again to your monitor's resolution. And this part of it isn't actually that new. But the big part that's new is the frame generation. And that means every frame that your GPU is outputting to the monitor, it adds a second frame that is purely generated by AI. So it makes an interpolation between the first frame and the second frame. And when you have 60 frames there, you should then have 120 frames. And this is right now happening to all GPUs of NVIDIA of the 40 series. If you have AMD, then you have there something called FSR 4, I believe. I'm completely not sure how it's handled there. But if you have a GPU of NVIDIA of the 50 series, they have there something new that's called frame generation 4, and that inputs not only one frame now, it adds 3 frames. And in theory, you should have then there 240 frames there. Practically in the game, I'm certain that it's not that perfect, and you surely have there some offset of that. But the core essential new thing, or why it's so important to me and why I call it a game changer, is it disconnects the pure performance from the actual visual performance in the game. In Planet Coaster terms, it was always about the piece count in the end. So those two things are now two different pairs of shoes. So the actual performance that you see from a player's perspective is something completely different than what's actually happening behind the processing of this game. When you have here like 1 million pieces in the game, let's say the frames drop down to 20 FPS. But since you have now this DLSS effect that adds 3 additional AI frames in between that, you are still at 80 frames per second, and that's enough to make a smooth image. And the evidence that it's like that, you kinda see it in this episode I made. I showed their footage of Planet Coaster 1, depending on how many guests you have in the park, 20 to 30 FPS in the game. And so since Planet Coaster 1 doesn't support any frame generation there of DLSS, I used a software DLSS called Lossless Scaling for only $6.89. And this little beauty of a third-party software, it gives you even up to 20 frames of this DLSS effect. And with that, I suddenly had like a super smooth experience in this park. It's finally playable after all. After all that effort of creating that with, I can remember even back to 2019 with only 9 frames on my very old potato PC, it was finally playable after all that time. And in retrospect, I'm so thankful to myself that I gone for that extra step, that I committed to that extreme of going super highly detailed, of investing over 2,400 hours on it and to build over 470,000 pieces in this game. I just hope that this whole monologue doesn't sound too arrogant to you, but it's just for me a huge relief that I know that all that effort got kinda rewarded with that technology. In those years where I stopped streaming, I was in a complete different mindset, and I was the opposite of happy about myself. For me, this whole thing that I did back then was a pure waste of time, because I saw no result of it. Surely, if you looked on it, it looked amazing, but what's the point of that park if you can play it? Nobody will give a shit about that. At least that was my opinion back then. Today, I'm more towards that opinion where it's more about that journey rather than the end result of it. But back then, since I was in complete disappointment about having only 9 FPS in this game, I was devastated in a way. And therefore I needed, in the end, a couple of years to find my spirit again. And that's kinda my justification why I go very hard on details here. It wouldn't make any sense to invest this whole time, this extra effort of telling you all of this here, if I just built a super cheap and, let's say, piece effective park here that only has a small resemblance of what you see in real life. And therefore it makes, at least in my opinion, much more sense to give it 200% here, to really go for that extra realism and to not get trapped into any discussion about the actual playability at the end. I feel with this technology, playability will be always there in some way. If it's now Nvidia's DLSS or AMD's or even the third-party DLSS of lossless scaling, I don't be bothered about that as long as this game and this park stays performant. As time is always moving onwards, the technology should get better in the future, right? And therefore we don't know. Maybe in 1 or 2 years we suddenly have a complete different GPU that might run this game as easy as a pie. That's for me the big thing. It's the beauty of unpredictiveness of our technology that we have. We don't know what happens in 1 or 2 years. And therefore why handicap yourself in this project in creating mental barriers in your mind to only use pieces now in a very restricted form to keep the piece count at a reasonable rate. So since I completely don't want that to be any narrative here anymore that limits ourselves. The only thing that has the utmost priority right now is the visual style and look of this park. We don't care about the piece count, we only care about the visual quality at the end. If this thing looks so convincing by itself that it even might have an effect on you in saying when you see it, wow, this looks great, then that's the thing why we are doing it. It's about the fascination of seeing our real theme park built one-to-one in a video game. And every step and every action we have to take here in order to achieve that result in the end is valid. So if we reach 300 or 400 or 500,000 maybe by the end of this main street, I don't be bothered about that. We have to trust here that the technology will save us in the end. Maybe you are a complete different opinion right now and aren't so optimistic about that whole thing. You might be also right here. I could be absolutely wrong on this. But when I would have to bet on my inner gut feeling, and after reflecting all of my experiences throughout Planet Coaster 1 and 2, and a little bit also Planet Zoo, then something tells me it's absolutely not relevant how many pieces we use here. Since we now have this technology, I'm very much convinced that we shouldn't bother about that anymore. And a part of creating this park, those videos that I release here, the main reason why I do them is not because I want to fully finish now this park in some way. I want to enjoy this journey with you. We have so many more episodes to come about all those different thematic areas and all the beauty and authentic stories that we will discover in the future. At least for me, that's the reason why I'm doing that. It's not so much about actually creating this park. I mean, it's part of that, but at least for me right now, it's about creating the story behind that and revealing a little bit of that magic of Disney and their theme parks, if that even is possible. After all, I just hope that this whole viewing experience is somewhat pleasant and authentic to watch. If it is, very hopefully, it also has a positive effect on yourself as you are watching. And so after all that long and tedious monologue I just gave, we might come back now to the build, since we are creating some quite serious roof here, right? I mean, half of this episode is only about creating this roof here. When I created that, I mean, those kind of roofs, they are not that easy to create, and in terms of the scale of difficulty, if there is even something like that in Planet Coaster, I would say it's pretty high up there. Since we have to work now not only on a axis that is not on world axis, so this whole thing is 45-degree turned, and then you have to care about all those different angles, and since every side here is slightly differently and has a different angle meant. At first I tried using those rotational pistons with the symmetry mode, but it absolutely didn't work in any way. And you also have the thing when you want to advanced move or copy something, you can't reopen then the UI since it's closed, and you always have to click on the very right side on add objects to add another art piece. And so this is absolutely not working here. And therefore we go now the old school road how to create that, and that is just by manually creating all those different sides on it. And earlier where I hold this monologue, you saw me creating this upper roof part here in a different shape. When I created that in the game and I saw those reference image right beside me, I did not completely focus here. And when you see the reference image, you have the three sections of this roof. So you have the lower part that covers this octagonal shape that is a little bit stretched, that picks up the geometry below it of the colonnade. Then you have a second section above that that is purely an octagonal shape. So it kind of serves as a bridging element between the lower part and the top part. And then we have the third section on the very top, and there you also have a perfect octagonal shape, and you have like this little tower there that has those columns inside it. At first, in between there, I also tried to make now a perfect octagonal shape there, but it absolutely didn't work and I cut it out of the footage here. So then I reworked that section so that you have at least the same geometric form like on the lower section. The main reason for that was just that I couldn't make this curvature that you see on the lower ground combined with now this conversion where you go from the stretched octagon to the perfect octagon. I mean, that's just so insane. I just can't explain it also really here. I feel it's absolutely fine, and to my eyes it looks pretty greatly built, and when you don't have the reference image right beside it, you will not be bothered about it, I think. And who knows, maybe in the future we come back to this little roof here and do it then properly. That's always the great part, when we have here something that is so annoying that really holds us up in some way, we can just skip it for now. Or at least we build something that looks pretty similar to that we can realistically build, and then in the very far future we replace that then with the real deal. In a second you will see another little issue where this top part is not in the perfect center, and therefore when I create those angled sides on the middle part, when I copy them around on the other side, they don't match seamlessly like they should, and you have like a little edge that you can see that is very annoying, I think. And so after that I made sure that the top part is really in the middle and redid this process. But it shows you that when you create such a complex structure here, you really have to be accurate. I think without that, you couldn't create that, or the result of it would look pretty messed up. When creating this roof, it kinda reminded me back to Space Mountain. I used there so many art pieces in different angled situations. So for example, on the interior of the station, I noticed this a lot. When I was accurate about them, the result of it looked pretty great. But if I slightly have the inaccuracy on the edge, for example, the whole thing will look pretty cheaply done. And so whenever I use art pieces, I take especially care that I position them very accurate to each other. One trick that you can apply here, I will just do it here in a second, where you just take every second surface that you have and just change the color for the contrast. And then you see this edge much clearer, and it makes this whole effort of creating a sharp edge much easier. But maybe at this stage, I mean, we are so deep now in this episode, for the last couple of minutes I would like to talk about the 6th update. So at the time of recording, today is the 27th of June, and I watched the recent livestream of them, where this whole livestream was mainly about Jurassic World Evolution 3, but there were also a small portion where they talked about the 6th update. And within that they showed primarily the souvenir shop and the Onride photos that you can then sell also later on in those souvenir shops. And so when I saw this souvenir shop thing, it's of course great for us later on when we're creating our own gift shops here. So you can then place down those preset shelves where you can select a specific merchandise article to be sold on, and you can also turn the visual of that off, and all those individual merchandise articles will be there as separate scenery pieces, and so you can rearrange them to your liking. And that's of course so great when creating a customly designed gift shop. But for me, whenever I see some updates like that, I always think about how to abuse now the game in the best way. And so for me, those little items there, like those mugs or something, when I can use them also on all buildings, they might serve as a great ornament, since they are probably very small. But for me, the really great part about this update are those Onride photos. And it's not so much about the actual function as a photo thing in your souvenir shop, it's much more the integration of this little feature. You can place an Onride photo camera on any track piece on any given coaster here, and you can perfectly position this camera like you want it. When you think a little bit about that, what that actually gives to this game now, you have here a camera that picks up constantly live footage of this park. It shows that within those billboards as still frames, but still you can set here a camera that gets monitored out to those billboards. And those billboards you can place them wherever you like. It kinda reminded me back to Planet Coaster 1, where you could place invisible cameras within the display sequencer, so that you could have like a preset camera perspective where you can always take a screenshot from that. So of course, I would absolutely love if they bring back this feature here, but when we are getting back to this Onride photo thing, when you abuse this little thing a little bit more, so when you place maybe a coaster below the ground, but you place the camera of that above the ground, this camera should take pictures there all the time the coaster train is passing by. In that way you have here like a live camera that gets output on any billboard throughout the park. The only handicap I can think of right now is that it only takes still images and no moving footage of it. But still, it kinda serves as a monitor there. And so for example, I could imagine if I make now an aerial image of this park here, I could assign a coaster below the ground, but the camera of that is actually 200 meters in the air. And whenever this coaster car is passing by, it takes a screenshot from that perspective. When the park is progressing over time, you can have the same perspective and it shows you the constant progress along this build. So really interesting stuff to think about. And all the time they bring out such a feature, you can kind of think how you can use it in such a way that it is not really there to serve its original purpose, but you could use it for something completely different. But still, if somebody listens from Frontier, please bring those cameras from the display sequencer back. It was such an amazing feature that we had in Planet Coaster 1. When you finally had your park built there, you could turn on like this slideshow where you just switch through all those different camera perspectives of your park and you can finally enjoy all people roaming around your own park there. The same thing when you open up Roller Coaster Tycoon 1 or 2, you get greeted with this slideshow of this amazing theme park there. And you can see people roaming around there and you see this theme park in action. And that is kinda relaxing in some way, just seeing this theme park playing out there. You don't necessarily have to play something now, you just watch, and that's something what I like about that. But having said all of those things today, I believe I will conclude it here. We talked about so many different things and this build comes really along nicely here. We have now the first array of buildings set here, and especially the Emporium building. I'm very proud about that. And in the next episode we will focus on those two buildings that will close this gap on the left side, so that the whole left side of this entrance area is finished for that. And so as I say always, if you enjoyed today's episode, subscribe, like or comment, become a member on this channel, join our Discord server, watch my other videos about Anaheim or Orlando, and thank you for watching. See you in the next one. Bye.